and to both. Okay, and to both of you for inviting me to give here this presentation. And I welcome everybody. And just to start, I won't be talking about very recent new research. I'll rather try to give an overview on the so-called Neo-Hittite or late Hittite or Syro-Hittite culture from the perspective of recent research, of course. But do not expect me to give absolutely new interpretations. So it will be rather an overview. Okay, let's start. So I have now the problem that I just see still the first slide. Okay, so now I hope it will be possible.
Yes, now we see it correctly.
Okay. Yeah, I cannot go back. So sorry, I have here still some problems with the presentation mode. My computer does not react on that. So I cannot go back to the slide.
We currently see the second slide with the map.
Yeah, but I wanted to go back to the first, and this does not work at the moment. I cannot go out of the presentation mode. However, we will try to do it as best as possible. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, the Hebrew Bible occasionally mentions the Hittites, who are said to have lived in the northern Levant in the early first millennium, alongside Canaanites, Amorites, and other peoples. This information coincides with the reports on of the Assyrians, who referred to the northern Levant as part of the and parts of southern Anatolia as the Hatti lands. However, the inscription of these principalities prove that they were inhabited by elites of different linguistic affiliations. Indo-European Luwian, written in hieroglyphs, Semitic Phoenician and Aramaic, written in alphabets. What is striking, however, is how similar the pictorial art, the composition, appearance, and use of the inscriptions and the functions of the sculptures are. This indicates a close cultural connection between the otherwise competing principalities, irrespective of their linguistic affiliation. That a certain multi- or bilingualism existed in these principalities is confirmed by the inscription of Yariri of Carchemish, who acted as a regent of the minor king Kamanis. The difficulty of finding a suitable name for this cultural area is shown by the various competing terms that can be found in the literature. Here is a small, of course incomplete list: late or Neo-Hittite, Syro-Hittite, Syro-Anatolian, Luwian successor states, and several others. Historical and philological treatises each focus either on the Luwians or the Aramean principalities, and almost never seen them as a connected cultural or even a political entity. Even though we lack king lists with reign dates from all of these principalities, there are so many inscriptions and also synchronisms with Assyria that at least a rudimentary historical chronology can be established and correlated with the development of art. Following Winfried Ortmann, a distinction can be made between the periods Neo-Hittite 1 to 3. Here you can see a provisional ruler table for the corresponding principalities with color marking of the style periods. And here are the art periods with their characteristics. I will not go into this further in the following, so here's just a very, very brief overview. The Neo-Hittite 1 period is characterized by the continuation of Bronze Age elements in style and iconography, and is attested above all in Carchemish, Melit, Aleppo, and Al-Dara. Many more examples Many more examples come from the Neo-Hittite II period, in which new iconographies and stylistic features emerge based on traditional elements. Finally, the Neo-Hittite III period is characterized by an increasing influence of Assyrian art on that of the Luwo-Aramean principalities. This became apparent earlier and more radical in the East than in the West. Thus, the art of the thus the art of the 9th century in Gusana was already very strongly Assyrianized, even if independent elements survived. It's going back. It started to become a little bit self-doing. That's okay. Sorry. But now let's have a look on the ethno-linguistic groups that carried the so-called Neo-Hittite culture. First of all, the question arises as to what is meant by an ethnic group at all. From today's perspective, ancient groups such as the Arameans are usually equated with ethnic groups, which in turn are defined by a common language and culture. Modern nationalism identified ethnic groups through biological lines of descent, an idea that has long been disproved, at least in science, but still persists in the public consciousness. Instead, ethnic groups should be understood as constantly changing cultural and social constructs. Thus, in time of upheaval and crisis, enthnogeneses occur, in which diverse groups construct common ancestry, often via a heros eponymos, irrespective of their actual origin, and redefine themselves through a common language, religion, or other cultural norms. But even after an ethnic group has been formed, it is still subject to constant change and reconfiguration caused by migration, external cultural contacts of all kinds, or other factors. Hence, an Aramean of the 11th century in Upper Mesopotamia means something different than in the 7th century in the Assyrian Empire. The same is true for groups designated as Hittites. Different lifestyles are possible within a certain ethnic group, or can be the same in different neighboring groups. Pastoralist nomads, farmers, and urban elites could define themselves as belonging to the same ethnicity or policy. However, since ethnic self-designations in the ancient Near East are extremely seldom, modern scholars either reflect on foreign designations, such as the Bible or the Assyrian invaders, or on the language in which the inscriptions were written or the names of the kings were given. But a short look on the king list of Sam'al, Sinjali, immediately proves that within one and the same dynasty, Luwian and Aramaic names appear. The first immigrants relevant to the formation of the Neo-Hittite culture may have arrived in the northern Levant from Anatolia as early as the time of the Hittite Empire. Hittites and Luwians may have taken leading positions in the administration of some northern Levantine cities, replacing the old elites. A second group of immigrants may have come to the coast of the Levant from the area of the Aegean and Western Anatolia in the course of the upheavals around 1200 BC. There they met the Autochthonous Semitic and Hurrian populations. In addition, in the course of the migration of Semitic nomads, new ethnogenesis occurred in which, for example, the Arameans emerged as a group. From this potpourri, new political units developed in the course of the 11th and 12th centuries, so that the political landscape depicted here and here is stabilized around 900. Let's take a closer look at these groups. We will start with the Luwians. The presence of Hittites and Luwians in the northern Levant is almost evident in Carchemish, where a cadet branch of the royal dynasty of Hattusha was established as early as the 14th century. This dynasty lasted well into the first millennium. It may be assumed that at the same time scribes, other administrative officials, as well as seal cutters and other craftsmen came to the city and gave it a strong Luwian component. Thus, hieroglyphic writing, which until then had only been widespread in Anatolia, and the Luwian language were able to establish themselves at least in the areas of administration and representation. After the end of the Bronze Age, the new script almost completely pushed back the cuneiform script that had dominated the northern Levant until then. The script is referred to by Yariri as the city, as that of the city, that means of Carchemish. Here you can see the approximate distribution area of Luwian hieroglyphic writing in the first millennium BC. It is important to mention that although we speak of Luwians from a linguistic point of view, this self-designation is not found in a single text of the first millennium to my knowledge. We do not have any ethnic self-designation of these people, who always identified themselves only with their political hometown. The designation Hittite comes exclusively from external sources, so that it is unclear whether it goes back to a memory of the homonymous Bronze Age empire or to an ethnonym spread beyond the official inscriptions. The next group are the Aegean immigrants, who are called Sea People after the Egyptian foreign designation. Almost nothing is known about their original linguistic affiliation because they obviously assimilated very quickly to their new linguistic environment. One example is the kingdom of Palestine or Palestine in the Amuk, which, according to the name of the country and the pottery found in the earliest layers of its capital Kunulua, Tel Tainat, was founded by immigrants affiliated to the Mycenaean culture. The surviving sculptures from this kingdom, however, are in the best tradition of Neo-Hittite art, and the inscriptions are without exception written in Luwian language and script, as the example of Taita's sculptures and inscriptions from the storm god temple in Aleppo prove. The next group is the elusive Autochthonous population that was already resident in the northern Levant in the Bronze Age. Most of them spoke northwestern Semitic idioms. The Iron Age Phoenicians, for example, seem to have descended directly from them. But what happened to the others? A clue could be provided by the oldest language documents from Sam al-Sinjali, which show a close connection to the Bronze Age Northwest Semitic idioms. It is conceivable that the city was founded by people that were displaced from the Amuk region due to the pressure from immigrants and, after a certain period of nomadic living, established a small principality in the Islahir region to the north, Sam'al, of their original homeland. For the reproduction of their earliest inscriptions, the lords of Sam'al did not resort to Luwian hieroglyphs, which were well known and widespread in their newly occupied region, but used the Phoenician language and script instead. After some time, the Phoenician alphabet was used to reproduce their own idiom, which can be regarded either as an own language or as an early Aramaic dialect. From the 8th century onwards, the Central Aramaic dialect and script prevailed. Let us move to the last group, the Arameans, who may have been an ethnic group composed by various elements. Without being able to go into depth here, a thesis on the enthnogeneses of the Arameans should be briefly mentioned. After the destruction of numerous towns at the end of the Bronze Age, a displacement of autochthonous population happened, which caused them to adopt a nomadic lifestyle. Partially, a unification with already existing nomadic and raiding groups with heterogenic constellations took place, for example, with nomad immigrants from northern Arabia. After some period, A new common cultural identity and language emerged, altogether with particular cultural norms. The country and tribe names Beit NN, House of NN, which is so typical for the Aramean principalities, shows the construction of lineages which refer back to a heros eponymus. Let us briefly look at the example of Gusana, the capital of a principality, first called Palais and later Beit Bachiani. Starting with the first mentions in the 13th century, nomadic Arameans started to challenge the Assyrian dominion in Upper Mesopotamia during the 11th century, first on the Middle Euphrates and later in the Khabur Triangle and the Turabdin Mountains, where they founded several principalities. Most of these groups were assigned to the so-called Temenite tribe. As is the case with the vast majority of Aramean principalities, the new rulers established a new capital next to the still existing former Assyrian provincial capital, Ashukani-Sikani in Tel Fakharieh, which continued to exist as regional cult center of the storm god Bel-Khabur. Such a pattern can also be seen, for example, in Beit Aguzi, where with Arpad as the new capital, next to the cult center of Aleppo. The inscriptions of the earliest known ruler of Gusana, Kapara of Palais, are written in Akkadian and cuneiform, but with distinct Aramaisms. One of the earliest Aramaic inscriptions at all derives from the same Gusana and was placed on a small altar, which you can see here on top. It dates to the early 9th century. A little bit later, to the second half of the 9th century, dates the Assyrian Aramaic bilingual on the statue of Hadadithi, governor of Gusana, which has been discovered in Tel Fakharieh Sikani, that you can see on the left. The earliest central Aramaic inscriptions known so far from the Levant dates to the late 9th century, included that of Sakur, which you can see here left top, or Bar Hadad of Aguzi, and the state treaties of Sphire. After the incorporation of the northern Levant into the Assyrian Empire, the Aramaic language and script spread rapidly throughout the empire. Hence, we see that Aramaic script and language emerged during the late 9th century and early 8th centuries. In the mentioned inscription of Yariri of Carchemish, the 4 then known scripts are called after their city of presumed provenience. The script of the city, that means Carchemish, were the Luwian hieroglyphs. The script of the city Sur, Tyre, was the Phoenician alphabet. The script of the city and land Ashur was the cuneiform. And the script of the city Taimani was obviously the Aramaean alphabet. Hence, the Aramaic script was either connected to the Temenites in Upper Mesopotamia or to the city of Taima in northern Arabia. We cannot exclude the origin of the Temenites from Taima, which would make this designation understandable. However, that indicates that the script was at that point mainly distributed in the east of the Aramaic regions. Now let us turn to the urbanism of these principalities. Here we face the problem that a considerable number of Luvo-Aramean cities were excavated south of the Taurus ranges, whereas only few settlements were identified and investigated north of the mountains on the Anatolian plateau. Although we know that larger cities must have existed there as well, some of them are already localized, our knowledge of urban layouts and architectonic features depends mostly on the northern Levantine sites. Hence, we do not know much about possible differences. In order to verify whether there is an urbanistic scheme typical of the entire Neo-Hittite culture of the Luvo-Aramean principalities, we will look at 2 examples located at the 2 extreme peripheries of the region, which have entirely different prerequisites. Sikili-Hüg in Cilicia and Tel Halaf Guzan in Upper Mesopotamia. While Sirkeli was a provincial town, Tel Halaf was the capital of a principality. The former probably had a primarily Luwian-speaking population, while the latter was dominated by Aramaic-speaking elites. Sirkeli had been inhabited since the Bronze Age without hiatus, while Tel Halaf was a new foundation. Tel Halaf consisted of a rectangular, peripherally located citadel and a walled lower town, also rectangular. Both areas appear to have been laid out towards the end of the 10th century. The citadel had at least two entrances, one from the south, from the lower town, and one in the north from the river, which flanks the northern side of the citadel. The interior of the citadel was divided into a higher northern and a lower southern part. The entrance between the two was formed by the so-called Scorpion Gate, which was located right next to the palace. To get from the southern citadel gate to the Scorpion Gate, a height difference of about 6.50 meters had to be overcome. The layout of the entire complex is reminiscent of Neo-Assyrian cities, such as the provincial town of Durkaklimu, located further downstream the Chabur. Here, both on the same scale. At present, it is not possible to determine with certainty whether there was a mutual urban planning influence and how it came about. Sirkeli, on the other hand, whose ancient name cannot be determined with certainty, was a town within the Principality of Hiyava-Kara, whose capital was Adana. It does not show any geometric outline. But here too, the citadel is located on the periphery of the city, not far from the banks of the Ceyhan River. In addition to the citadel, the city has an extensive lower town and an upper town situated on the neighboring natural hill, both of which are surrounded by a city wall. Outside the fortification are workshop areas and a suburb on the opposite side of the river. There is evidence of large buildings on the citadel, some of which were obviously also decorated with architectural sculpture. The lower town was surrounded by a double ring of city wall and a moat. Its foundation took place its foundation took place in the 10th century and consisted of masonry stone blocks. Significant differences in height between the inner citadel, the outer citadel, and the lower town indicate, as in the case of Gusana, an internal segregation that was further emphasized by fortification walls between the different city districts. If we now compare the citadels of the two cities, we not only see that both are almost the same size and located on the periphery of the respective city, we also see that both were divided into two parts at height differences. A comparison shows that there were differences between the two cities, especially with regard to the function and design of the layout. However, it is also noticeable that there are a number of similarities. In addition to the almost simultaneous foundation of the fortified lower towns, there is also the identical size as well as the location, size, and subdivision of the citadels. If we now look around at other towns of the Luvo-Aramean world, we find similar patterns. The most important Neo-Hittite city, Carchemish at the banks of the Euphrates, also has a citadel peripherally located on the riverside. If we take the Great Staircase as the entrance to a lower part of the citadel, then it also seems to have been divided into two parts on different elevations. The citadel of Kunulua, Zelthainat, also shows such a division, although it is not located at the periphery of the city. But here too, clear differences in height can be observed. The same is true also for Sam'al, although here too the citadel was located almost in the center of the city. This could be related to the fact that the city was not located directly on a river. The layout of the city was circular. Other cities, like for example Arpad or Tilbarsib or several others, also show such a layout. If we now list the criteria of the citadel, its location and division into two parts, as well as the formal design of the lower town, and arrange the places geographically, hardly any pattern emerges, except that divided citadels are obviously present in most of the towns. If, however, the same towns are sorted according to whether they were newly founded in the Iron Age or widely settled towns of the Bronze Age, more patterns can be discerned. For example, almost all new foundations show a geometric ground plan, be it round or rectangular. These observations can be noted as follows. Numerous urbanistic specifics are present in most principalities. This raises the question of the causes. Are they a result of structural similarities or of diffusion? Structural similarities could lie in similar social structures and ruling ideologies, as the segregation of elites in citadels indicate. Similar political conditions and security needs could also have played a role. A diffusion might have been stimulated by the outstanding role of the city of Carchemish, especially at the beginning of the Iron Age, and favored by migration and mobile craftsmen and specialists. Here, further research must provide information. This brings us to the elites. Who were they, and how did they represent themselves? First of all, we need to define what is meant by this much mentioned elites. It is important to distinguish between political, cultic religious, economic, military, and intellectual elites, namely scribes. Of course, an overlap of elite groups is possible and surely was frequent. The various elites need by no means have belonged to the same identity or ethnic group. As we have seen, the scribe of Kapara of Gusana bore an Akkadian name and was familiar with cuneiform, thus presumably be of Assyrian descent. As we have seen, the palaces of the political elite were located in walled and elevated citadels, often on the outskirts of the city. Modeled on the Hittite metropolis, imperial Hittite metropolis Hattusha, they consisted of compact individual buildings without inner courtyards, grouped in ensembles around open plazas. The example of the citadel of Samal, here to the left, is particularly impressive. The preferred form of construction was the Hilani, so named nowadays after an Assyrian term. It was a tripartite building with a broad columned portico, a vestibule, and a central hall. This type of building emerged as early as the Bronze Age in the Amuk region and the neighboring Islahir plain, and spread from there to Upper Mesopotamia during the Iron Age. Here on the map, you can see the distribution of this type of palace in the pre-Assyrian Iron Age. So will not talk about the Assyrian adaptation of this building type. The easternmost example comes from Gusana. The Western Palace there was decorated with sculptured orthostats and monumental statues on the outer facades. Other places were also decorated in a similar way, as we can see here with the example of Samal. Undecorated orthostatic slabs were known in northern Levant since the early 2nd millennium. Occasionally, they were also decorated. Stone blocks with reliefs on external facades of buildings or gates were known in imperial Hittite architecture of Anatolia. As a result, the plazas in front of these buildings, these Hilani buildings, as well as other enclosed squares, such as the area below the citadel of Carchemish, became zones of visual communication that obviously served for ceremonial performances, as Alessandra Gilibert could demonstrate. Similar zones that served as political significant spaces due to their sculptural decorations were the city and the citadel gates, as Stefania Mazzoni has shown. Here is the example of Asitavadaya, Karatepe in Cilicia. The reliefs show either religious scenes or the ruler in ritual acts, hunting, or war. These themes are also the subject of the rock reliefs and rock inscriptions, almost all of which are found in the north, in or north of the Taurus. On the one hand, these monuments are important territorial markers, but on the other hand, they also fulfill commemorative functions. One example is found in the Kizildar-Karadar complex, where a depiction of King Hatabu can be seen. Its dating is again the subject of controversial discussion due to the new finds from the neighboring Turkmen Karahuyuk. The rock inscription from Topada celebrates the military success of King Vasosama, and the rock relief from Ivris, the worship of the storm god by King Varpalavas. While the worship of gods and depictions of hunting are also known from the art of Imperial Hittite period, the public depiction and description of military performed represent an innovation that possibly goes back to an early Assyrian or even Egyptian influence. A very important element of the ruler's ideology of the Luwian and Aramaic principalities is the state organized and institutionalized ancestor cult. Dominique Bonatz has taken an in-depth look at the so-called funerary documents of these principalities, which were clearly of fundamental importance for the creation of a state identity. Here you can see two examples of grave stelae which show the deceased sitting on a throne and holding a bowl in his hand. The example on the left comes from Sam'al, the one on the right from Marash, the capital of Gurgun. Examples of statues as funerary documents were found, among others, in Tel Halaf, where two such figures were found in chapels standing above cremation urns. In their overall iconography, even in their style, the sculptures are in the tradition of Bronze Age Levantine ancestor cult images, such as these two, which flank the entrance of the royal tomb in Katna. Here you can see the find spot and the statues in situ on both sides. Most principalities with Luwian-speaking political elites have less emphasized on ancestry than those with Aramaic-speaking ones. Here, primarily reference to the city pronounced, maintaining an urban identity. In the case of the Arameans, the principalities were often named after a heros eponymos, giving stronger emphasis on ancestry, presumably as a result of the more recent ethnogenesis, but also of the often still strong nomadic element in the society. But in all cases, population was presumably linguistically heterogeneous, since the policies were not defined along ethnic boundaries. Therefore, techniques for creation of political identity were required. One was the institutionalized ancestor cult as systemic element of state identity formation. The techniques were obviously already present in Bronze Age Levant. Let's now turn to the world of the gods and their temples. Both the inscriptions and the images show that, on the whole, the same gods were worshipped in southern Anatolia and northern Levant during the Iron Age as in the Bronze Age. Many iconographies are based on older models, as illustrated here by the example of Ishtar from Aindara, which shows very strong parallels to older representations. This also applies to many representations of the storm god, who was worshipped in numerous aspects under his Luwian name Tahunzas and Aramaic name Hadad, or simply Baal, Lord. Here he is depicted as rising in his chariot drawn by bulls on reliefs from Melid and Aleppo, and an imperial period representation of the same time from Imamkulu on the right. In the 8th century, this form of representation was also implemented less dynamically in round sculpture, as several examples show here. Picking up on Bronze Age Northern Levantine models, the iconography of the same god standing on a bull and holding a bundle of flesh is spread. With the other hand, he often wields an axe. Other representations of gods can be identified with various deities known from the Anatolian or Semitic pantheons, such as Baal Semet, Reshep, or Kubaba. While some iconographies may be new developments of the Iron Age, the gods themselves have all been attested since the Bronze Age. A genuinely Aramean deity cannot be identified. This corresponds to the fact that many of the large interregionally important sanctuaries of the Bronze Age continued to exist in the Iron Age. For example, the temple of the moon god in Haran or the storm god of Aleppo. The latter was excavated before the Syrian civil war by a Syro-German mission under Kai Kohlmeier. Originally, the podium of the cella was situated in the central axis. Later, the cella was restructured. The inner walls were decorated with sculptured orthostats. The most recent datable reconstruction, with the construction of new reliefs, dates to King Titus of Palestine, who apparently ruled over Aleppo for some time. Later, the city came under the rule of the Principality of Bit Aguzi, whose capital, new founded capital, Arpad, was founded 30 kilometers north of Aleppo. So we can summarize as general trends that almost all worshipped gods were already known in the Bronze Age, and their iconographies were adapted, albeit with new stylistic expressions. Both Bronze Age Anatolian and Levantine iconographies were widespread and partly mixed. Most of the great temples from the Bronze Age were still in use and of international importance. Obviously, there was a syncretism of Semitic and Luwian gods like Tahunza with Baal, etc. There are relatively few new religious elements, but a growing interregional prominence of several local cults like that of the moon god of Haran are detectable. As an example of cult architecture, let us briefly look at the temple in Aindara, which already existed in the Bronze Age and was probably renovated at the very beginning of the Neo-Hittite period. The site is not far from Aleppo, near the modern city of Afrin, and was investigated by Syrian archaeologists under Ali Abu Asaf. Until its destruction a few years ago, it impressed with the good state of preservation and the building decoration that remained in situ. The alternating use of black basalt and white limestone is striking, resulting in an impressive appearance that was to become characteristic of Syrian architecture. Contemporary examples are known from Carchemish and Gosana, as well as from written evidence about the temple of the moon god of Haran. You can see here the text mentioning this decoration. The building is a classic example of the temple in Antis, which had a columned open entrance niche in front, a broad antecella, and an almost square cella with an axially positioned cult podium. The whole building sat on a terrace and was surrounded by a gallery. The roof was accessible via a staircase. The stone blocks of the walls were decorated with reliefs on the outer facade and partly also inside. The temple type emerged in Upper Mesopotamia and Northern Levant already in the early Bronze Age and was a characteristic feature of the Northern Levantine cultic architecture of the entire second millennium. The Bronze Age temples in Anatolia and Mesopotamia, as well as coastal regions of the Levant, belong to other types. Hence, the Temple of Eindara stood in a North Levantine tradition and shows a dissemination of various principalities with either Aramean, Bidagusi, Luwian, Carchemish, and Aegean, Palestine elites. So there are, of course, several variations, like the so-called Mikdal Temple, for which the Temple of Hadarik is an example. Here you can see, for example, one of the temple in Antis excavated in Kunulua. The biblical description of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem fits perfectly to this type as well. However, the sculptures that decorated the building show a clearly Anatolian iconography, as the example of the mountain gods show. Here, as an comparative example, you can see Eflatun Pinar from the late imperial period to the right. To sum up, the dominating temple architecture derived from Northern Levantine tradition, while its decoration stood in both Anatolian and Levantine tradition. At least in Eindara, Hittite iconography was predominant. Thus, the temple in Eindara shows a close connection of Anatolian Hittite with Levantine tradition, which was an expression of cultural restructuring during the last phase of the imperial period and directly after its end. Here we once again have to stress that we do not know anything about the type of temples that was in use in all those principalities lying to the north of the Taurus mountains. So we hope in future we will get any information on their layout. So far, there are only few studies on the ordinary urban population, which is mainly due to the lack of sources. Nevertheless, on few sites such as Sam'al, Gozana, and Sirkelihyük, houses in the respective lower towns have been examined, which provide information about the living conditions and cultural orientations of the inhabitants. In Sam'al and Gozana, images were found that testify to the fact that ancestor cult was also practiced outside the political elites, which used similar techniques in smaller scale. Here you can see the statue of Kamaki from Guzana and the stele of Katamuva from Sam'al to the left. Both persons are likely to have come from the milieu of the economic upper class. So both were not part of the political elite, and their houses can be localized in the lower towns. But nevertheless, they could afford that kind of monumental statuary or relief stele. A large number of studies have looked at small-scale art of this period, especially ivory objects and metalwork. It would be worth a lecture of its own to talk about this, so I cannot afford that, and can only give a very, very short overview. Many attempts have been undertaken of stylistically attribution to specific workshops, most of them with rather modest results. Obviously, there was a frequent and fast circulation of goods and craftsmen between the principalities. Therefore, we can observe a quick exchange of styles and iconographies. This is probably also responsible for the parallel development of large-scale art such as sculptures in the principalities. As for the ceramics, no common tradition in all Luvo-Aramean principalities is detectable. Often local traditions dominated the production, which in some cases go back to the late Bronze Age. There were only few common wares like the so-called red burnished or red slipped ware. The pottery indicates different trade and cultural contexts. Chiava, that means Plain Cilicia, for example, was part of a Syro-Cilician ceramic koine, a kind of a pottery which is only seldom attested in the neighboring entities to the east. Assyrian influence varies according to the region. In the east, we can observe an early and complete adaptation of Assyrian forms and wares. So for example, after the incorporation of Gozana into the Assyrian Empire, the ceramic production was completely Assyrian. Whereas in the West, a later and much less complete adoption happened. In some places, only local and rather simple imitations of individual Assyrian vessel forms appeared. However, an overall analysis of the pottery of the Luwo-Aramean principalities is still missing. So let's come now to the end and the question if there was a Neo-Hittite culture at all. We see diverse and heterogeneous ethnic groups and languages not only throughout the territory, but also within each principality. The respective identity, primarily emphasized in inscriptions, is the affiliation to a political entity, whereas ethnic or linguistic units are not thematized. As techniques of identity formation, we see, among others, the institutionalized ancestor cult, and in Aramean principalities, the invocation of a Heros Eponymus. The principalities had obviously similar social structures in common, independent of the ethnicity of their political elites. There was a segregation of the political elites, but also a visible presence of other, namely economic and intellectual elites, such as scribes in the inscriptions and sculptures. Another common characteristic is the adaptation of the existing religions and cults, which led to the maintenance of the time-honored temples. Some commodalities are present in urbanism, architecture, and visual arts evident, despite the political fragmentation and ethnic heterogeneity, and indicates common cultural norms. Similar social structures, but also the diffusion of role models from Carchemish and the mobility of artisans were probably responsible for these commonalities despite political rivalry. Most of the cultural norms go back to Levantine and Anatolian traditions of the Bronze Age. City planning with a citadel divided into two parts could go back either to the Hittite or to the Mitanni models, perhaps like Hattusha and Taidu as examples. Palace architecture had its roots in Levantine tradition, the arrangement of individual buildings around enclosed plazas in Anatolia. The temple architecture again shows the Levantine tradition, the decoration with sculptural orthostats, Anatolian and partly also Levantine patterns. The definition of public space as a zone of visual communication and a setting for identity-building ceremonies is again a Hittite element, the iconography and style of the depictions a mixture of Anatolian and Levantine models. And finally, the technique of institutionalized ancestor cult with monumental statues and reliefs roots in the Bronze Age Levant. So that we can conclude that the innovative moment of the Neo-Hittite culture is the close connection of all these traditions and their novel manifestation. And with that, I thank you for your patience and your audience.